explicitly support the slave trade in the Bible, explicitly so.
Well, he'll cite
there's
Dr.
other
Josh.
types of slavery, though, right?
That's his citation, Dr. Josh.
So, Snake, we're allowed to like interrogate these people now? Is that what this format allows? Because I'm all down
These
with it.
people.
Interrogate.
It's kind of trying to hold them accountable for certain claims that we would like to hear more information on.
Okay, can I go? Because I have a huge one that I'd like to add.
It's not time for you to debate, but time to hold their feet to the fire on a claim they've made.
All right, well, this is just one that I want to really get some clarification on because I feel like it's been consistent throughout this entire debate. Jill, can you actually define what you mean by gaslighting and how this applies to this debate? And
well, what I mean by that is that he's using these words, buying, purchasing, as if, and that seem to have a negative connotation. Not realizing, perhaps this is an innocence, not realizing that to the ancient Near Easterner, these would have been opportunities. These would have been what we call jobs, travelers who were looking for opportunities. It would be a sin to reject them. So the God of the Bible says, yes, you may purchase them. You haven't demonstrated that the purchasing is one of some sort of slave auction, like we would see on the movie Roots. Turn Roots off, open up a book about the ancient Near East, and learn what these words meant to these people.
Me.
Hello and welcome to Debate Cafe. Looks like we got a good showing tonight. And tonight we're going to be debating biblical slavery, specifically the motion, the Bible supports slavery. Mark, in the affirmative, will go first, and you have 5-minute opener.
Okay, just give me time to just get quickly set up. I apologize.
We'll just start the time when you start your speech.
Fantastic. That sounds awesome. And I'd like to share my screen if I could. Just tell me when it's coming through.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Hello, my name is Mark Reid. I'm discussing the proposition, the affirmative of does the Bible support slavery? I want to thank Debate Cafe, Snake was Right, Cinematic Psychology for running the debate, and I thank you for joining me here today. Firstly, I want to define the terms, what is meant by slavery and support. Slavery comes in a few forms, but in essence, slavery is when one human being is owned by another and deprived of most of the rights held by ordinary people. Note the definition is most of the rights, and the slaves could still have rights. An important definition of slavery is that the slave had no autonomy and considered owned by the master. Now, it may be argued that slavery at the time of the Old and New Testament was not as harsh as antebellum slavery of the South, and I ahead of time would like to concede this point. However, that does not make the foreign chattel slaves free, and it doesn't mean that slavery was not practiced. A person owned by another person is still a slave, no matter how many rights they have. We will be talking about the 3 types of slavery outlined in the Bible and the 3 types of slavery it supports, which is chattel slavery, where somebody is owned in perpetuity, debt slavery, where somebody works for a certain amount of time to pay off a debt, and blood slavery, when someone is born into slavery. So slavery is a condition acknowledged in the Pentateuch, which a person is deprived of freedom at least for a period of time. Subjugation to a master, and that master may benefit from the labor of the slave. Slavery may be involuntary, in which case a slave is generally considered to be the property of the owner and such bought and sold. In Pentateuchal legislation, involuntary permanent slavery applies to non-Israelites. Slavery may also be voluntary for Israelites, such as when they agree to work, to pay off debts, or survive poverty and destitution. That comes from Gene Howells. So generally to support legally would be to uphold or defend as valid or right. We do know that the area of ancient Near East did have slavery, but does the Bible support this? Does the Bible uphold the rights of the slave owners to continue the practice of slavery? Does the Bible advocate for the institution of slavery? Absolutely it does. And I'll go through some passages from both the Old and New Testament shows the Bible was the codified laws regarding the practice of slavery that allowed the continuance of the institute of slavery during the time of the Bible. The institution of slavery is explicitly supported by the Bible. and it gives regulations regarding the treatment of slaves, how long they can be held, and how seriously they can be punished. So let's start with Exodus. Here we see the differentiation between a Hebrew slave that is bought by a Hebrew master. This is debt slavery, where the person binds themselves to the master due to financial struggles or owing money. Do note that if the master gives the male slave a wife and she remains property of the master, note that any children that are produced are the property of the master of well. This is blood slavery. This is where children are born into slavery. The offspring of the slave are slaves with no option to voluntarily become a slave or consent to enter slavery at all. Note also that a Hebrew slave can become a slave for life should he accede to this and be marked with an awl drilled through its ear. Also note that it supports the sale of a woman slave by her father, and she will not go free as male servants do in the 7th year. Exodus also supports slavery, outlining the punishment a slave could receive and outlined when the punishment was too severe. This passage is a direct codification of corporal punishment that is meted out to slaves for disobedience to their master. So we are to ask, what does the Bible advocate for here? Can we just imagine the beating that would prevent a person from recovering in a day or two? Free Hebrew subject of such an assault would be compensated. However, this verse clearly states that the slave is their property and tacitly endorses a lack of punishment for this violence. So I would like to point out exactly when it refers to beat a slave with a rod, what a rod is and what it's used for. This is the rod and staff of herding people, as referenced in Psalms. The staff was a thin crook used for guiding livestock, while the rod or shavat was a short, blunt, heavy wooden club. It was used for hitting livestock to get it moving. This rod could cause significant bruising and trauma to a person, but it would rarely kill. However, it certainly would be something that no free person would endure. It is interesting to note that rods were also used to beat children, as in spare the rod and spoil the child. The passages in Exodus outlines the worth of a slave. This is a clear case of the slave not being worth the same as a free person. In this case, the slave is worth 30 shekels. Note that the compensation is not paid to the slave when gored by a bull. It is paid to the master of the slave. And this is a common feature of slavery institutions and something that the Bible supports. It is the master compensated for the damage to his property, the property being the person, not the victim or family of the victim. And this is from Dr. Joshua Bowen. Basically, it says that there were laws in place to prevent the master from abusing his slave. That does not indicate that masters were not permitted, and they may have been encouraged to physically discipline their slaves with wooden rods, as we saw the rod earlier. And he does note that slaves are not considered to be equal value to free persons. There was a class distinction between the free person and the slave. Moving on to Leviticus 25, these passages differentiate.
Right, that is 5 minutes, Mark.
Okay, done.
Okay.
My apologies.
Alrighty. And Jill, it is your turn.
Okay. All right. I didn't know we had 5-minute openings. Oh boy, I better make this quick. I'm gonna have to speed through this, so if I'm moving a little fast, you'll just have to rewind me. I'll play it back. All right. The reason I'm ready whenever you are. I'm sharing.
Okay, we can see it.
All right. I'm showing you this map for a reason. If you ever read any of the holy text, the so-called holy text, you'll notice that they don't have maps. The Bible has maps because it's historical and evidential. So the first thing you'll need to know if you're reading the Bible is what's going on in the Bible days. For one, if there's no God, I know this is a precept argument, but if there's no God, first and foremost, if there's no God or any enduring moral standard, then you can't judge anything that's right or wrong or good or bad in the Bible. But anyway, precept is the silver bullet to the atheist's head. That's why I really use the argument, because the debate will be over too soon. And I like to torture my opponents. Atheists really don't study the text. Okay. The Bible is not a rule book in which you can just look and see these rules or to be applied void of any social or economic or historical background or context. The Bible was written over a span of 1400 years by 40 different authors and different authors, yet all never contradicting each other. If you're not willing to study the cultures chronicled in the scriptures, you're not ready to even begin to learn how to read the Bible. You often hear me say, you don't know how to read the Bible. That's what I mean. God is addressing the culture that is surrounding the nation that he wants to build. The people come from these empires that he will start this nation with. So God didn't create a new being and say, hey, you're Israel. No, he took people out of Abraham. He called them out of the land of the Chaldeans, right? So you have to take that into consideration when you're reading the scriptures. One of the major themes in scripture you will learn today, hopefully, is that when God says to these individuals who he knows their background, he knows you're from the hood, he knows what you're doing, he knows what your family was doing, he knows all of that. He says, learn not the way of the heathen. So you could cite biblical scholars who is telling us what's going on in the Hittite Empire, who can tell us what's going on in the Assyrian Empire. But the Bible, God's people, were to be set apart. Learn not the way of the heathen. Mark wants you to believe that chattel slavery is one of the ways of the heathen. We were to learn, or the Israelites were to learn that way. When thou come into the land which the Lord God has given thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. Now, we're going to talk about aliens, not these aliens. What does the Bible say about aliens? Because the atheists will try to leverage the fact that there were different rules for aliens. Duh, there are different rules for aliens in the United States, if you haven't noticed, but they're not oppressive. They're designed to promote the nation's sovereignty. That's how you do it. Okay, you want to be a citizen here, you should learn how to speak English, but I can't say that. But this is a liberal channel, right? So I can't say that.
We're a neutral channel, but
We're a neutral channel. Okay, we're a neutral channel. What does the Bible say about loving your animals? Leviticus 19, Exodus 12. This is a constant theme throughout Scripture. You are to love the stranger as yourself. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the sojourner. That's the stranger, that's the alien. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You shall not, when God says something twice to you, 3 times in the same chapter, when God says something 3 times in the same chapter, he means it. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him. Why? Because you were sojourners, you were strangers, you were aliens while you were in Egypt. This is a constant theme. What the liberal wants to do is isolate a passage apart from the context of the whole of Scripture and try to interpret it based on what he reads on the Bible, theevilbible.com. But we're not going to do that today. The word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, do not fear, I am a shield to you. Your reward is great. Abraham responded to God, saying, Lord, what will you have to give me, since I don't have a son to inherit my wealth? Who will inherit my wealth? It is Eleazar of Damascus, his slave. Wait a minute. I thought Eleazar was a slave. How is he going to inherit all of Abraham? Abraham was like Bill Gates back in the day. He was a very rich man. Eleazar, his slave. So obviously, we need to define slavery, or we need to define what slave means in the Bible. Okay. Why is it that scholars, these are the top scholars here, this paper is from the top scholars on this issue, probably in the world. This is from Laura Clubberson, and these are, they call themselves the, um, I can't remember the name, but these scholars are from the University, the Oriental Institute Thank you. Oriental Institute. Thank you, Holy Spirit.
Okay,
These are the top scholars in the
that
world.
is 5 minutes. I gave you a little extra. You can finish your sentence if you need to.
Let me just finish up. The question is, why are these scholars, are they contradicting themselves when they use the word slavery and enslaved in the same sentence? They're not contradicting themselves. There's a difference between someone being enslaved, which was punishable by death, and someone working as a slave, which was a voluntary deal. Okay, and that's hopefully we'll be able to bring that out later on in the discussion, in the cross-examination, etc.
Okay. And Mark will start us off with our cross-examination, and I'll give you guys equal-sized panels for that.
And I'd just like to, kind of reiterate that Debate Cafe does not identify with any political side. So we strive to be a neutral platform, and I really just want to make that absolutely clear.
I'm sorry, I have a habit of calling everyone a liberal. I apologize.
Both of us are actually politically.
I know Snake's not a liberal. He corrected me. Snake is not a liberal, and he's an atheist. He's very rare to see a kind like Snake, I must say, because most liberals are atheists.
Did you mute me?
I had you. I think everyone was muted for that opening.
Okay. Just be aware, Jill, that sort of liberal in my country means something totally different. The liberals are actually the conservative party.
I know. The liberals know who I'm talking to. If you don't apply, let it fly.
Okay.
Like I tell my students.
Sorry,
but thank you, guys. Go ahead.
Yeah, so neither of us are politically typical of either side. So, so Mark, you have
cross-examination.
15 minutes to grill your opponent, and whenever you start.
Yeah, fantastic. So you just sort of said that there were people not enslaved working as slaves. Do you concede, Jill, that there were people working as slaves in the time of the Bible?
They would not have been considered slaves today. The challenge for the skeptic is to define the word slavery as we would define it today. You would not define someone who voluntarily worked for someone else. You would not define that person as a slave. So it's disingenuous to therefore use the biblical terminology and suggest it's called gaslighting, I think you would say, right? You guys out there know what gaslighting is? To use the word slave 50 times, it's like Donald Trump saying, oh, I'm going to win, 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 I'm going to win. You're trying to convince the audience of something that's not true. Slave to them meant more than someone who was being forced to work. Slave to them could also mean someone who volunteered. You need to make that distinction. You need to be able to prove from the text which one is which, not just use the word slave.
Does the Bible say that you can purchase slaves from the nations around you, and that you can purchase slaves from the foreigners living in your midst? And if you do purchase slaves from them, does it say that you can keep them and pass them on to their children?
I wish I had more time in my opening to explain all of this, but you're using the word slave here as if someone is being forced. When you say the slaves may come from other nations, are you suggesting that they're being forced to come from other nations? And if so, where is that in the text?
This is my question time, not yours, Jill.
Okay, well, that's my answer. You haven't proven from the text that they were forced to come from other nations. You're assuming that. And you know what they say about people who assume.
Could a Hebrew slave or a person working as a slave freely leave at any time?
Sure.
Okay. Could a foreign slave or a foreigner working as a slave, as you put it, leave their servitude at any time they wished?
Depends on how they wound up in that position. If they were a prisoner and they were there to pay restitution, according to Exodus 21, they are there because they're guilty of a crime. Just like today in our society, in America at least, if you commit a crime, you are now a ward or property of the state. You would even be, in some cases, you would work. You'd make license plates and you would do other things. And it's really, really sophisticated. Really, I really, if you really want to come to my channel on my next video, I'm going to go over slave work in jails today in America. What's called, it's not considered slavery. You don't consider that slavery. So why are you forcing the word slave in a exploitative sense onto the Jewish people when all they're doing is locking up their criminals like we are today?
What passage of the Bible does it say explicitly that slaves are guilty of a crime?
Let me get you that. Exodus. Give me 1 second. The word is restitution, and it's in Exodus 21. Basically, the slave could basically pay back the person who he harmed by working for them. So instead of putting them in jail, you would work for the person who you wronged, and you would work until it was decided that your debt was paid in full. This is in Exodus 22:3. Even a convicted thief could make restitution by serving as a quote unquote slave. Again, we would not call that person a slave today unless you want to gaslight. So continue going on doing so.
So what if it applied to all slaves? Why does it say even a criminal?
Even a convicted thief could work, it could pay restitution, right?
Yeah, so does not suggest that even, as in even someone that has done wrong could serve as a slave in addition to all the other people?
In addition to even a convicted thief could work as an aved. I like to use the word aved. In this case, he would probably, because he's a criminal, he would probably not have a choice, which he shouldn't.
Were there other people who were aved apart from criminals?
You could be someone who was in debt. You could be someone who just worked for another. There's a story in the Bible about a young man working for another man's daughter for her hand in marriage. He worked 7 years, and then he worked another 7 years. That's a lot of work, man. She must have been, but so yes, in those times, work was a way of payment. You cannot call them slaves today. You would not call someone who volunteered to do that a slave. Why are you gaslighting?
Could a father sell their daughter as an aved?
Could their father sell their daughter as an aved?
A father.
Yes.
Any father.
Yes, and his son.
If a master beat their slave with the rod and they were bedridden for 2 days, then got up, what would be the punishment for the master beating their slave?
If the master beat his slave, well, why is he beating his slave?
This is my question time, not yours, Jill.
If he were beating his slave, it would be because the slave had broken the law, probably that he had stolen something. If the slave survived a day or two, then it was determined that it wasn't malicious. The slave is his money, so the slave owner would be responsible to pay basically the hospital bills, to pay for the damages that were rendered.
I do think it's fair to ask some clarifying questions as well, but continue on. Seems like you guys are working through it.
Let him continue.
Yeah, so where in the Bible does it say that that beating is only for people that have stolen something?
Well, that would be the punishment under Old Testament law. Under Old Testament law, you would beat someone. So you want us to, again, assume and make an ass out of ourselves, excuse me. You want us to assume that the slave is being beat here arbitrarily, even though you don't have a shred of evidence in the text to suggest such. The slave is not being beat here arbitrarily because he's a slave, okay, or because he's black. All right. In Deuteronomy, if you read the actual text and read the Bible in light of itself, instead of taking little bits and pieces and isolating them. If you read Deuteronomy 25, we read there that a judge will decide the case, and if you're found guilty and you deserve to be beaten, you shall be flogged. Okay, and oftentimes in the ancient Near East, the owner of the household had that responsibility. It was his land. He controlled his workers, his employees. That was a form of punishment for a crime committed. You just couldn't beat him because he wasn't working too hard. But that's your assumption.
Does Deuteronomy 25 in any way state that is the punishment for slave stealing?
Deuteronomy 25, it says when men have a dispute, they are to take it to the judges and they will decide the case, and innocent and acquitting the innocent, condemning the guilty of a crime. If the man deserves to be beaten, I just use stealing as an example. The judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence with the number of lashes of crime he deserves. Did you not know that beatings were part of the Old Testament punishment for crimes?
This is my question time, not yours, JiL.
Okay, so you assume that the beating here was something arbitrarily done, and because this person was a slave and maybe a lower position, that he just, beat his own worker for no reason. I'm just going to beat him because he's a slave. That's your assumption, right?
This is my question.
This is Mark's questioning.
Does Deuteronomy 25 at any point mention Ebed?
No, when men have a dispute, Eveds are men. That's how I check. Well, then nowadays we don't know what a man or a woman is anyway. So maybe that's the problem. When men have a dispute.
Does the Bible say that foreign Ebed could be property that could be passed down to their children?
If they wanted to be passed down, they would put pierce their ear and pierce themselves to show their loyalty to their master, only if they wanted to be Eveds for life. The only people that were forced to be workers or criminals, people who are enemies of Israel, even like what we would call a POW today, they basically were what we might call a prisoner today. We still wouldn't call them a slave. That being the case, you still would not call that person that's doing 20 to 40 a slave. But yet, in the case of the Israelites, you do that.
Does the Bible say that you could pierce the ear of a Hebrew Ebed and they would be passed down from generation and were slaves for life?
Well, the Hebrew would not, it was not allowed for a Hebrew to become a slave for life, because the idea was to encourage citizenship and encourage sovereignty and to grow. So you wanted everyone to become an Israelite who sojourned to the land. So that was the deal. You become an Israelite, you inherit all of the privileges of being an Israelite. If you become an American, you inherit all the privileges. Green card holders don't have the same rights as I do. Is that slavery? No. It's the idea is that we want to encourage citizenship, and we want people to drop those false gods and accept the God of Yahweh. This was a Yahweh cult. This was a Yahweh tribe. Keep that in mind. Remember, we got to put ourselves in the ancient Near East, not in the 21st century today. You probably wouldn't want to join a cult today. But you would have wanted to join the Israelite Yahweh cult back then. Mark, you would have been the first in line.
Okay, so let's go on to the New Testament. So why in the letters to Philemon did Paul not tell Philemon that slavery was wrong?
Because it's not wrong. It's only wrong when you are forcing to do someone or to force someone a slave. Remember, the top scholars don't consider slavery and in slavery to be the same thing. You might, because you don't understand how words are used, but the law, if you look up Wayman Westbrook, another scholar on this issue, an expert in the law, he will tell you it's not the same thing. Only in America do we think slave and enslaved are the same words. I actually made that mistake in my graduate studies, and my professor corrected me. Now I'm correcting you.
Okay. Why did Paul return Onesimus back to Philemon if he did not support slavery?
Again, you're gaslighting, sir. Look up the term. I know I'm borrowing from my progressive so-called Christians, brothers and sisters, when they use the term. You haven't demonstrated that that the slave there in Philemon is there against his will. You're just using the word slave and expecting everyone in the audience to assume that he was brought there in chains or that he was forced to work. So Paul is doing something immoral by telling him to go back to an oppressive situation. That's your assumption. You haven't proven that from the text. Just using the word slave is not going to work, as we saw in well, I didn't get a chance to show you, but I'm planning on showing you what scholars have to say about the definition of slave as opposed to enslaved.
Why does Matthew explicitly say slaves obey your masters?
Because we are to obey those who have rule over us. But you're ignoring the distinction between a voluntary act, and you're just using the word slave, and you want us to assume without proving, you have to prove from the text that these slaves are forced to be there. And then Paul says, obey your master. Paul would never say obey your master if someone kidnapped you and forced you to work in their kitchen. He would never, and you came to Paul and said, Paul, what do I do? And he says, obey your master. No. Paul would never do that. Okay? Paul is talking to someone who obviously, for whatever reason, is there in this position. Probably he owed debt, or he was working to pay off a debt. Okay? So yes, you should. Bernie Sanders wasn't around back then. So you couldn't just get out of your student loan. You should pay back your debt.
Was it a voluntary act on the part of the daughter when the father sold her into slavery?
I would say that the parent, even still today, I know they're trying to change that up in Canada. Better not come down here with that mess. But according to human rights activists, children's rights activists, parents have full autonomy. So if a parent was in need for whatever reason, fell into hard times, they often, because the younger children, especially the boys, 10, 11, 12 years old, they would be the ones who would have the ability to work. If you turn 35 in the ancient Near East, you're done. So yes, they would hire out their children to work. Again, how do you know the child didn't want to work? In an ancient Near Eastern context, you're telling me that the parent dragged the child down the road and said, hey, you're going to pick this corn? Is that what you're trying to?
All right.
Is that what you want us to imagine?
Time, Jill, not
this
yours.
is Mark's time, but he also ran out of time. So, Jill, if you wanted to
I'll start there.
Roll that into yours. Just
I'll start
your question for everyone. And,
sure. Yeah.
I'll start whenever you go.
I'll start right where we left off. You want us to assume that the parents drug the children down the road to work for the neighbor, kicking and screaming, and therefore slavery? Mark?
No, I think that there was probably a few cases where the children wanted to work, or there are other exceptions, but the Bible doesn't clearly outline this, and it explicitly states that a father can sell the daughter. It does not in any way disambiguate between the willing and the unwilling. And certainly there were children that did not want to work, or something would happen that they would find themselves wanting to be slaves. And the fact that the Bible makes no differentiation between it means that it does support the selling of a daughter, no matter what the circumstances are.
Okay, so you don't have any evidence from the text that the child there didn't say, yes, we need this money. Let me go, Dad. Let me go mow this lawn. Dad, let me go cut this grass because we do need the money. You don't have any evidence that was the case. And if that wasn't the case, you're going to say it's slavery if the child didn't want to go. But if the child does want to go, it's not slavery. You don't make much sense, Mark. let me ask you this.
Is there a question?
Let me share my screen really quickly. This is Dr. Raymond Westbrook, one of the leading scholars in this area. If you want to talk scholarship, for every liberal quack you can bring up or think of, there are scholars that will refute everything that are coming out of their mouths, including your evilbible.com, by the way. Okay, this is Dr. Westbrook here. He says, in law, a slave may be defined as a person who is owned by another in the manner of a chattel, subject only to special considerations that may arise from his humanity. The relative terminology can be misleading, right? If you're not careful, if you're not understanding the historical context, the social economic context, it can be misleading. And why? Because we only use the word slave today to describe someone who is forced. We never use the word today to describe people who are in jail, even though according to the Constitution they are. Okay, so what is your yes?
We're breaking format a little bit.
Okay.
So
I'm asking the question. My question is coming now.
I just want to make sure there's a question. Okay.
What is your response to Westbrook here when he says that subjects of a king were called slaves, meaning that there are context and behind or nuances, and the only way to determine whether or not this slave is here involuntarily is through the context, which you haven't yet done? What is your response to Dr. Raymond Westbrook?
Yeah, so if you could leave that up, I'd like to address that you haven't actually read what this has actually said, because it says, in the strongly hierarchical societies of the Reid, the slave was used not only to a person owned in law, as in saying there is people owned in law by another, but to any subordinate in the social ladder, right? So it's basically saying there was two usages of the word abed, and we do know that. It was used to refer to the people who were actually in slaves, and that's where he says not only to a person owned in law by another, thus stating explicitly that there were people owned by another, but to also a subordinate in the social ladder. So what we're talking about is that we have these words that were used to describe subordinates, and the same words were used to describe slaves. You have to actually look at how they're treated to understand the context.
Okay, can you answer my question?
Could I finish, please?
Okay.
Could I finish?
Yeah,
the words were used in not only to describe subordinates, but also the actual chattel slaves that were there.
So he says context is the only criterion which you have not given yet. You haven't given us any context. You gave us a bunch of scriptures. You said the word slave 50 times without showing us any context or evidence within the language or the text where someone is being forced against their will. The challenge is to show us not just the word slavery, but show us a group of Israelite taskmasters, slave masters, traveling through the ancient Near East, rounding up people and bringing them back to Israel to work for them against their will. Can you show us that in the text, sir? Dr. Josh sure couldn't. Let's see if you can.
Yes. Yes, so I don't have to show tribes of slavers roaming the countryside, grabbing people and bringing them back to Israel. All I have to show is that the Bible supports the institution of slavery, either in the area or in Israel itself, or the nations of Israel itself, which I have done. I've shown.
So you don't have to show the context in which that word slave is used.
Can I please finish?
Okay.
I have shown the context of where it says you may buy slaves, you may keep slaves, you may beat slaves. So when we're talking about context, what scholars understand and consensus scholars all agree on is that there is no way when you talk about somebody as being your subordinate that you can beat them with a rod. There's clear stipulations that when you strike them,
I've already explained what the beatings
provide compensation for them for striking them. That doesn't apply to slaves. So when you're reading that and saying, oh, well, context is important, what you don't understand is that scholars understand this context and have applied this context. And I've referred
haven't cited any scholars.
What I've said.
But my next question. You're not willing to study the cultures chronicled in the text at all. If the Bible is, or as is, if the Bible as it is already constructed, if it condones or promotes rather the practice of chattel slavery, that's involuntary servitude, why then did the slave traffickers in South and Central America and also the Caribbeans change the Bible, took passages out of the Bible? In fact, the curator to the what's called the Slave Bible in the British Museum notes that 90% of the Old Testament was removed from the Bible that they gave to the slaves. If the Bible as it is, as you say, already condones or promotes rather chattel slavery, why did they feel the need to remove passages from it? Why couldn't they give it to them as is?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is antebellum slavery of the South and the Caribbean kind of thing. And this is very, very simple. The treatment of the slaves in the Bible was better than the treatment of the slaves in antebellum slavery. The slaves did have some rights in the biblical slavery that they did not possess in antebellum slavery. And I'll happily concede that antebellum slavery was way worse than what's being described here in the Bible. However, that does not mean it's not slavery. And so what they did is remove certain passages that gave slaves some measure of protection from their masters, albeit pretty small, in order so they could treat them very, very badly, and basically not have rebellions on their hands because the slaves were reading these passages. But that's really irrelevant because
so all right, so they did it because slavery wasn't
Near East does
not
I got
your answer.
Not
I got
slavery.
your answer, which is the non-answer. I got you. All right, so they did it because they wanted to prove not the Bible as it is already promotes slavery. So they just removed those parts because the Bible already promotes slavery. I get it. All right. So if your definition of slavery includes those who are being punished, does your definition of slavery, let me ask it in a question. If you're 90% of the Old Testament, that's supposed to be where slavery is being promoted, right? 90% of the Old Testament, right? Okay. Yeah. Slaveholders are doing the same thing you're doing now. Only you're not doing it for the purpose of exploiting a human being and their labor. You're doing it for the other purposes, but they're doing the same thing you're doing now, taking the word slave, omitting the passages that talk about a slave has rights. They're there voluntarily. You can't kidnap them. Omitting those passages and force them to work. And just using the word slave. See, obey your master. That's what you're doing now.
Is there
Can you share my screen?
Here?
Can you share my screen? Yeah. Here's my second question, which you're not going to answer. If your definition of slavery, okay, and Brittany here is a slave right now in Russia, okay? If your definition of slavery, that's why she's playing. She plays for Team Russia. Yeah, Brittany plays for Team Russia, guys. All right. If your definition of a slave includes those who are being punished for a crime, is America, home of the free, home of the land of the free and the brave, is America also guilty of supporting slavery? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. If slavery is those who have
is America, here's the 13th Amendment. Have you read the Constitution of America in the United States? Okay. In America, slavery is outlawed except as a punishment for a crime whereby the party has been convicted of that crime. Right? That's Brittany's reading what a slave or what the 13th Amendment actually reads. Is America guilty of promoting slavery?
So I'm very confused because I understand that this basketballer is being held in Russia, not America. So I don't know why America.
All right, forget about Brittany. Answer the question, sir. The 13th Amendment says that slavery is outlawed in America.
I'd like to answer the question
unless you are being punished for a crime.
Could I get
is America guilty of promoting slavery, sir?
So what is the question, Joe?
The question again. I don't understand why he's not getting it. He doesn't want to get it. In America, slavery is abolished, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime where the party has been convicted. Is America guilty of promoting slavery or supporting slavery? Yes or no?
No.
Okay. So then don't do it to the Hebrews.
However, I do
So then
want to
don't do it to the
clarify some of
Hebrews.
the things that you
Don't
went through in
gaslight.
your
Stop the
question.
gaslighting.
Can I
And
please
stop
answer the
promoting
question?
the idea that the
You
Bible
have to allow
supports
your
slavery.
opponent to answer the question. So please allow Mark to speak.
Permission to treat this witness as a hostile.
No, go
No.
ahead.
No,
Nothing hostile about me, Jill. Not yet. Anyway, keep going. So when we're talking about duly convicted people as being prisoners, basically, it's saying that no person that hasn't been convicted of a crime will ever enter that state of incarceration. It's basically saying that there must be a reason for the state to implement that, and that reason must be a violation of the laws. You sort of said 90% of the Old Testament, and it was used, and I agree, it was, the Bible was used by slaveholders to justify their enslavement of the black people in antebellum slavery. I 100% agree with you, and the reason why is because it does support slavery. Now, this is weird because this woman was imprisoned by
Are you going to
Russia,
answer the question, sir? Are you going to talk about Brittany Greer?
I am.
Okay,
this
so
woman
America
was imprisoned in Russia, which is sort of a wrong.
Okay, who cares? Who cares? So America does not promote slavery.
So I can't seem to sort of get my time.
So America does not promote slavery.
Still doesn't apparently want
okay.
you to want me to
All
answer. Right. So the problem.
How much time do I have?
The problem here is that
okay.
2 minutes.
Sir, you're filibustering. You answered the question already.
Excuse me,
Jill.
Jill, let me.
All right.
I'm trying to filibuster my time.
So, this is ridiculous. Like, he won't let me answer.
He answered the question already.
Is the question, Joe? Is the question still whether America supports slavery? Because that's been answered.
That's the question. Yeah, and he said no. He answered. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, but I would like to add that the Bible supports slavery when a crime is not.
Sure, you haven't proven that, but okay. All right, so in the Bible, it says that Abraham's Eved, his, what scholars would call his Ibrahim Eved, or Eved Ibrahim, and the Muslims might say, Eliezer. Eliezer was said to inherit all of Abraham's property once Abraham died. Okay. Do you think that Eliezer was forced to be there? Now, Eliezer was born in his household, meaning that his parents were probably workers for that estate before he came along or he grew up. So he grew up in the household of Abram. Do you think Abram forced or whipped him or forced him to work? Do you think
I don't know. The text is silent on whether Eliezer was there voluntarily or whipped or had any kind of punishment meted out for anything that he did.
Do you think Eliezer would?
Abraham actually did imprison Ham and made the Canaanite slaves.
Do you think Eliezer wanted to stay? You're pivoting, sir. Stay on topic. Do you think Abraham wanted to stay?
To answer here,
you're pivoting to something that has nothing to do with the topic, sir. I'm not talking about what Abraham did to Lot.
Yeah, so Eliezer, it doesn't say where he may have been beaten at some point, and you cannot show that he was not. You're just assuming he was not because he happened to be one of the very few slaves that got something really good out of the deal.
All right,
just because he got something really good out of the deal at the end of his slavery. Does not mean that he was not a slave, and it does not mean that there weren't tons of other slaves who did not inherit Abraham's property, and in fact were beaten and were treated.
You haven't shown that, sir. You haven't shown that. All you did was gaslight the entire time. You haven't shown anything.
And so, if we wanted to just go directly into open conversation, we can pick up right there.
I would like to question Jill about that. We'll just move straight on to the topic of why are you saying that Eleazar wasn't beaten when the text does not say in any way that Abraham never beat him?
I actually
or didn't have any other slaves that beat him?
I actually
no. I'm asking you, Jill, if you could.
I didn't ask you that. That's why. I asked you, do you think he wanted to stay there?
Could you address
considering the terms of this agreement? Do you think he wanted to stay with Abraham?
Could you answer the question, please? Why are you saying?
I'm not answering the question that I didn't ask. I asked you, do you think he wanted to stay? Do you think that this was okay? He did want to stay. Do you think that he would want to stay in this situation?
I don't know. The text.
If he could inherit all of Abraham's wealth,
once
Abraham died,
whether he hated to be there, whether this wealth was compensation for a life treated dreadfully, the text does not say, Jill. But so what I'm asking you is, how do you know? How do you know that he wasn't treated badly because he was given compensation at the end of his slavery?
Whether he was treated badly or not, you haven't proven bad treatment being prescribed. You could say what if, but you can't show me a text that says you can beat your slave. It said if you beat your slave. It didn't say you could beat your slave. Okay, you're gaslighting, sir. You've been doing it the whole debate. Did you really come here and think this was going to work? Because it's not.
That's not what I'm doing, and I think that
try again. I'll give you some more time.
So this basically says an owner who so it basically says that when you beat your slave, anyone who beats their slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished, therefore setting up a legal stance of exemption if the slave recovers in a day or two, and then goes on to explicitly state that that slave is their property. It belongs to them, and that's why they shouldn't be punished.
Yeah, he's doing it again. And until you can demonstrate
the slave wasn't their property, why would it?
Until you can demonstrate that anyone in these texts are there against their will. Don't tell me what the slave did or how long he was there or how long he worked, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years for his life. If he wants to be there, he's not, according to the law, according to experts in the law, like Raymond Westbrook, he is not enslaved. He wants
Raymond
to work.
Westbrook agreed with me, not you.
He wants to work.
Only
Raymond Westbrook.
Slaves. No. Westbrook agreed with me. As
no,
we
he
looked
didn't
at the
actually.
passage that you held up, it said
no, he didn't actually.
Were their slaves. There were people that referred to their subordinates.
The king himself. Well, let's read. All right, let's pull it up again. Let's pull it up again. Show me where he agrees with you.
More than happy to.
Yeah, let's pull it up again. All right. So the subjects of the king were called, quote unquote, slaves. And even though they were what? Free citizens. What he's doing, hold on, let me finish my thought, please. What he's doing, can I finish my thought? So what he's doing is he's telling you that, hey, there are other contexts in which this word slave can be used.
Yes.
How does that support your argument? Where you want to take the word slave and only make it mean forced labor every time you see it in the text?
Because not only was there context when it referred to subordinates as slaves, but also referred to actual slaves as slaves. That's why it says not only to a person owned in law by another. That is explicit slavery that he's referring to.
Oh, okay. So now we're back onto trying to then pigeonhole the Jews into some sort of oppressive culture because they have jails and they put people in jail who fight against their armies. We do that today, genius. You don't call that slavery. Why, when the Israelites do it, why do you call it slavery?
I didn't mention fighting against their armies in any way, shape, or form. I'm not sure where you're getting this from.
But say that again.
It says that you can buy slaves from the nations around you, and those slaves
you haven't demonstrated that those slaves.
You could also say that those.
Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do.
Into slavery. No. I want to address this. No, you're not changing the subject.
I'm not changing the subject. I'm not changing the subject. I'm going to try a different approach.
You've got no.
I'm going to try a different approach.
Tell me this. were slaves beaten against their will? Were they beaten voluntarily?
If you broke the law, you should be beaten. You should be punished if you broke the law. So of
Where
course
does
it's
it say they
against your
broke
will.
the law? Where does it say they broke the law?
Okay. We're gonna look at Leviticus. You brought up Leviticus 25. Can you show me anywhere in Leviticus 25 where the people who are coming from other nations are coming by force, meaning the Israelites went and kidnapped them? Can you show me that in Leviticus 25, please? I'll go through Leviticus 25, the entire chapter with you, and show you those are all voluntary business transactions, as the Oriental Seminar suggests, who are the experts in this field. These are all business transactions, and you're going to tell me that one of those verses out of the 40 is involuntary or something that is oppressive. Good luck with that. The context destroys that argument.
Address it, please.
The question, I think, was... were slaves beaten voluntarily?
With slave, that doesn't make any sense. Does the police arrest you voluntarily? When you commit a crime, they do. Yes. You haven't demonstrated that the slave is being beat arbitrarily because he's a slave. That's your assumption.
And you also haven't
do more than
demonstrated
provide your assumption in this debate, please.
Any crime at all. That's
do more than provide your assumption in this debate, please.
Yeah, so you haven't demonstrated that slave is being beaten for any crime at all, because the text.
I showed you in Deuteronomy 25 where a slave could be beaten, or anyone could be beaten. It says a man can be beaten. Okay, I've showed you context where someone could be beaten, whether they were a slave or not, for breaking the law. Can you show me anywhere in Scripture where a slave can be beaten just because he's a slave?
Yes, it says you can beat your slaves with a rod. Yes, that's what.
For what reason can you beat them? Does it tell you the reason in that text?
It doesn't tell you the reason, but it does not put any restriction.
It does not tell you the reason in that text. So why are you assuming that the slave there is being beat?
Question about Leviticus 25.
Why do you think the slave?
Leviticus 25:44.
Why do you think the slave is being beat? Let's ask for your opinion, because that's all you've been providing in this debate is your opinion.
We need one at a time.
Why do you think the slave is being beat in Exodus 21? Why do you think? Because all you've been providing is your opinion. So let's continue with your opinion.
The will of the master.
Expert opinion. Go ahead. Why?
It's just the master wants to beat the slave. It doesn't say
exactly. Okay, let's move on.
Why? And I mean, I can refer to Dr. Bowen.
Thank you. Thank you for proving the point. You just lost the debate. Thank you. We can move on to something else now. He's being beat because he's just a slave, right? I'm showing you from the text reasons why someone could have been beaten in the ancient Near East. You're telling me, oh well, he's just beaten because he was a slave.
That is acceptable.
I just watched the Roots, the new version.
That it does not provide any limitation on.
I don't know about Snake, but I personally would prefer if we could have a little bit more of a discussion in which I would like understand. That, yeah, especially I feel like I'm hearing a lot of over talking from JiL, where Mark is trying to answer your question and you're just kind of talking over him. So we can't follow it, we can't score it if you guys are all talking at the same time. So let's try to be respectful and let our opponents talk one at a time.
I'll do my best.
So Mark was. You were going to bring up something by Josh Bowen?
So Josh Bowen goes on to sort of say that there is no instructions on the circumstances of why the slave was to be beat. From context of the sources, he sort of says it doesn't say that not only were masters not restricted in these passages, they also may have been encouraged to beat their slaves, as it says in other passages in the New Testament, that being too nice to a slave is probably a bad idea because they'll get complacent and coddled. So from the context, we can see that it was for rebellious behavior, and at the very bare minimum, it doesn't provide any guidance on when to beat a slave. It just says it is something permissible to do. But I would like to address Leviticus 25 because JiL did bring that up.
Let me respond to that. If you guys are interested in actual scholarship on this issue, Harvey A. Hoffner, a scholar in the ancient Hittite religion or civilization, Princeton University, guy has a PhD in ancient Mediterranean studies. He's all over the place. If you really want to know what's going on in Leviticus 25, Exodus 21, Is nothing here about someone beating someone. This had more to do with a legal issue, and whereby it was needed 2 days was needed to adjudicate to find out what really happened. This was a domestic dispute between an owner and his worker. And when you have a domestic dispute and money is involved, the court gets involved. That's all this is in Exodus 21. It's nothing to do with you can beat your slave. That's the most ridiculous opinion. It's not even an expert opinion. He's just making it up. He got it from evilbible.com.
No, it's actually
Harvey A. Hoffner. Harvey A. Hoffner.
Does that passage in Exodus? I mean, you said Leviticus. I'm not sure why, because Leviticus has nothing in it about beating slaves. It's Exodus.
Exodus. Okay.
That passage in Exodus, does it say that the worker is your money or your property?
Yes.
Yes, that's it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amen.
Conceding.
That's true today.
So I'd like to address
your
Leviticus
workers. Okay,
25.
excuse me. No, well, you're not going to gaslight and leave the audience ignorant of what these terms purchase and buy mean. Okay, stop the gaslighting. These terms had meaning. They had meanings to them today that are different than us today. So when you were to purchase someone, it would be tantamount to an NBA owner purchasing a player on a team. This is according to scholars like Dr. Paul Capon, who wrote one of his latest writings Is God a Moral Monster? Okay, these are scholars in the field. They're not agreeing with you, Mark. You're not citing any scholars. You're just making stuff up and expecting us, because these terms and these words mean something different to us today, and most audience members are not aware of that. That's gaslighting. That's dishonest. Stop. Repent.
Could a manager who purchased a player beat them with a rod?
No, you couldn't beat anyone, but the police would beat him with a rod if he broke the law. So you're conflating. You're conflating. The owner did. The owners today don't have that authority. Owners did back then. Owners had the authority to enact punishment on people on their land, on their property, committing crimes. So that, in that sense, there's not a parallel, but there are parallels in the sense that these are voluntary contracts. You haven't demonstrated from the text that anywhere in Scripture it is prescribed that an involuntary servant would have to work for another person, and they don't want to be there, other than in the cases of criminality, POWs, etc., or even sometimes debt. You had to pay back your debts, so you work to pay off the debt. You haven't demonstrated that. You just keep using the word slavery, purchase, buy. This is Matt Dillahunty 2.0.
Okay, so the problem here that you have is that you're saying, oh, it's only work to pay off your debt. It's voluntary. It's like an MBA contract. The problem that you have is that the Bible goes on to clearly say that you can own these foreign slaves for life. Where
if they want to be owned for life.
Can I please finish?
If they want to be owned for life.
Please, could we moderate here? I can't seem to get a sentence out without JiL jumping to the top of it.
You left that part out. I just thought I'd add it in.
So where was I? Yes. So you're saying, oh, they work to pay it off and then they can leave, which is not true. That says that you can own them for life and is passed down to your descendants. So what you're trying to equate is an MBA contract where a player is taken into the household of another, is able to be beaten, is owned for life and has no opportunity to get out, and can be passed down to that MBA person, manager's descendants as property. And if that is not how. Please, JiL, just have some self-control.
Can you prove otherwise?
With an MBA player, they are not owned like the owning in the Bible occurs. So you are completely and utterly 100%.
Are both voluntary?
Well, you've already admitted and conceded that a father can sell their daughter.
Okay, we're not talking about a father and a daughter. You're pivoting.
You've already conceded
are
that
both
point.
The situations in which an eved, in majority of the cases, again, unless you were a POW or a criminal, in all of the cases, other than in those cases, the person is there voluntarily. That's the parallel that I'm drawing. I'm not saying that the owner or the person plays basketball. Okay, you're trying to make a one-to-one correspondence between the two cultures. All I'm saying is that both are voluntary. The owner had the right, because he was the police and he was the owner. So he had the right to enact justice. also. He also was the owner. So our owners today don't have that. We have police officers for that now. Okay, so don't try to say, oh, well, could an owner beat his slave? No, the owner can't beat it, but he can call 911 on his teammate.
So yeah, this whole idea of they were all there voluntarily or criminals. There is nothing to support that.
I didn't say all.
Scholarship consensus.
You're not being honest. I didn't say all.
Scholars. There were two types of abed. There were those who were Israelites who had gone into slavery voluntarily, or it specifically says they may be impoverished and need the money, therefore be coerced into slavery in a sense, such as what happens in debt slavery. There was also the abed that were bought from the nations around, and it clearly says that, and I'll refer to Leviticus where you said, where does it promote it? It's Leviticus 25:44. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Those slaves were not voluntary. They were enslaved by other nations and then sold to the Israelites as slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, members of their clans born in your country. They will become your property.
Can you demonstrate that the people there are against their will? They're against their will, sir.
For life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
Can you show that the people are there against their will?
That shows that the Bible explicitly supports the slave trade.
Can you show that the people are in Did you know Dr. Josh doesn't even hold, after his debate with us, he doesn't hold to Leviticus 25 as forced servitude? Did you even know that? You didn't, did you?
Well, I mean,
talk to him about Leviticus 25 again.
It's as bad. I don't think it's as bad as
antebellum. Do you have evidence that the Aved in Leviticus 25, sir, is there against his will? Do you have evidence of that? Yes or no?
I don't think I have evidence that they're there against their will.
Why are you assuming they are?
Excuse me, can I finish, Jill?
Why are you assuming the worst?
Yeah, see, this
why
is
are you
just
assuming that?
And
I can't get a word out edgewise.
I would like to hear your answer, Mark, but I'd also like to know, Jill, if you could unpack your claim that Dr. Josh Bowen, right. Doesn't use Leviticus, passage anymore?
From what I'm hearing or what I've heard, he does not hold that Leviticus 25, that these are actual sojourners. The word there in the Hebrew does not indicate someone who is a chattel slave, but someone who is traveling, sort of like of Mice and Men. Remember that old book novel? We used to read real books in high school. Now we're reading the new Jim Crow. The sojourner would travel from land to land on people's property working. Yes, you may purchase them. In fact, Christians adopted this practice so much that in Christian Europe, from the 5th century to the 10th century, slavery didn't exist. Why? Because the Christians went and purchased them. They weren't going out rounding up slaves and putting them in chains. They were allowing these people to come and work for them, and they would adopt them as like they did the Old Testament. Scholars call it adoption through manumission. They would adopt them and they would become part of the family. This is what Laura Clubberson, this is what the scholars like Christopher Wood, scholars like Fred Donner, this is what they're talking about in their seminars, that there's papers written on this.
Okay.
I don't understand why we're still using gaslighting, using the word slavery, expecting us not to go behind you and look up, go research the Oriental Institute seminars.
Okay.
Number 7.
Address the question.
Are we at the portion where the judges ask the contenders questions? Is that what?
Yeah, and I've been kind of trying to just ask them questions to kind of stay on track so far.
Sure,
but
okay.
Mark, I wanted you to answer and give you a time to answer Jill's question about were those slaves that in this context right now, is there evidence that they were purchased against their will? I think you were going to respond to that, or whatever you were going to respond to.
There's no explicit statement they were purchased against their will. And I would agree, as far as I know, Dr. Bowen says that these slaves, they were not treated as badly as antebellum slavery. That wasn't like the slavery in the South. That's not what it was like, and no one is claiming that it is. But they were still property, and it clearly states they were slaves for life. They had no option to get out of their slavery like the Hebrew slaves did, like the Israelites did. That makes them chattel because they can be passed down to their descendants. That's exactly what chattel is. And for JiL to sort of say
Citation,
all
please.
of them wanted to be there is completely facetious. There is no evidence either that they did all want to be there, and the text doesn't say that they voluntarily were there. JiL does know that the nations around them enslaved people involuntarily, and there was no prescription to find out if they were voluntary or involuntary. And that passage does explicitly support the slave trade in the Bible, explicitly so.
Well, he'll cite
there's
Dr.
other
Josh.
types of slavery, though, right?
That's his citation, Dr. Josh.
So, Snake, we're allowed to like interrogate these people now. Is that what this format allows? Because I'm all down
These
with it.
people.
Interrogate.
It's kind of trying to hold them accountable for certain claims that we would like to hear more information on.
Okay, can I go? Because I have a huge one that I'd like to add.
It's not time for you to debate, but time to hold their feet to the fire on a claim they've made.
All right, well, this is just one that I want to really get some clarification on because I feel like it's been consistent throughout this entire debate. JiL, can you actually define what you mean by gaslighting and how this applies to this debate? And
well, what I mean by that is that he's using these words, buying, purchasing, as if, and that seem to have a negative connotation. Not realizing, perhaps this is an innocence, not realizing that to the ancient Near Easterner, these would have been opportunities. These would have been what we call jobs. These would have been traveling or travelers who were looking for opportunities. It would be a sin to reject them. So the God of the Bible says, yes, you may purchase them. You haven't demonstrated that the purchasing is one of some sort of slave auction, like we would see on the movie Roots. Turn Roots off, open up a book about the ancient Near East, and learn what these words meant to these people. The most important thing was relief from debt, and that was a way to pay back debt. There were, again, as I mentioned earlier, there were criminals who would work as a slave. Now, these words were later interpreted or translated into slave. You need to seek more contemporary, a more dynamic translation, dynamic equivalency, to deal with the words and the language. But debt and slavery and buying, all of those words have to be unpacked. The buying of a Hebrew servant in Exodus 21 would likely refer in Leviticus to a servant, a foreign, a haburu, I think they're called, or a Hebrew or a haburu servant. These were not people who were rounded up like Boko Haram does.
Okay. So Mark, any thoughts on that? These are just jobs?
Yeah. So from what JiL's described, he's described people in debt that are forced to apply to somebody voluntarily out of necessity to work as their unpaid servant because they are in debt, and when they pay off that debt, they're released. Is that what you're saying, JiL?
You owe money. If you owe money to Citibank, you're going to work for Citibank until Citibank is paid in full. Citibank doesn't care. I'm answering your question. Citibank doesn't care if you're working for McDonald's. They're still going to expect their money. Okay. Yeah, and yes, you have to pay back your debt. Bernie Sanders didn't exist back then.
Yeah. No, I just want to hear that's what you're saying. And just for that temporary time, they were property of the Citibank, right? They were their property.
Again, you're using the word property. In the ancient Near East, property just means you had a human pledge. You pledged yourself. That's all it meant. You made a promise. You made a commitment. Okay, let's start using terms. Let's start using terms that we would use today if we were to see two people engaging. We would not call 911 and say, and the same thing that's going on in the ancient Near East, you would not call 911 and say, hey, this person owns a slave. And 911 would arrive. 911 would arrive and say, who called 911? And what are they going to do? They're going to question the person you said was a slave. And he's going to say, I'm here because I want to be here. And he's going to arrest you for filing a false report.
Jill, just stop the
So
911.
you have to do more than just find slave in the Bible.
I just have a quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you realize that I just described debt slavery exactly?
I just described debt slavery too. Citibank. You work. Listen. The Bible is clear. This is why I love the Bible, because it's so true and it corresponds to reality. The Bible says this: the borrower is slave to the lender. That's a concept that is still true today. If you owe Citibank, they will garnish your wages. You will work, or especially if you owe the government, you will work until that debt is paid in full. You are subject to Citibank. You may be working for McDonald's and think, oh, well, my McDonald's is paying me, but you're really working for Citibank until that debt is paid. So although we've sophisticated the process, the concept is still the same. The borrower, you borrow money, you now become a slave, quote unquote, to the lender.
Right.
Don't condemn a culture because they're doing the same thing your culture is doing today. That's called being a hypocrite.
And would you say the Bible supports this practice?
The Bible does support paying back the money you borrowed from someone else, whether you work for that person, whether they garnish your wages, or you just pay it back voluntarily. You should pay it back voluntarily. The Bible teaches pay back your loans, Christians.
Yes.
Stop defaulting on your loans, Christians. Okay, the government shouldn't have to come after you.
Okay, so
they shouldn't have to come after you to get their money back.
Okay, so that's one thing.
I did want to explore the distinction between slave and enslaved. I didn't quite get that part.
Enslavement, I think he said.
Okay. Jill, you're
slavery and enslavement. Yeah, Jill.
What's that?
What's the distinction between slavery and enslavement?
Well, it's quite simple, really. I mean, let me just show you what the Geneva Convention determined. This is where states or countries, statesmen, countrymen come together and they decide the definitions of these terms, right? So they can convict certain people, certain warlords in certain countries. You can share my screen. So they can convict them of crimes or crimes against humanity. So they come up with definitions of these terms. The difference between someone who is a slave and someone who is enslaved, which you tried to conflate this entire debate, and the fact that you're asking me that question means that you weren't prepared for this debate. The difference is an enslaved person is someone who is made a slave. Very simple. If you're making someone a slave, making them a worker, making them a maid, making them a butler, then you have enslaved them. That is illegal. That's punishable by death, like Exodus 21:16. If they are a slave, meaning that's their job, they work for a living, they're migrants, then it's not illegal to hire them or purchase them or buy them.
So Jill, from my perspective, and I think this would be the normative description of these words, is that enslaving somebody is the verb in the past tense to do something, like you're enslaving someone. A slave is the noun description of the state of being, of having been enslaved. Do you understand that? There's no differentiation between them in the normative definition of these words.
Right. A slave is someone who has been enslaved in our vernacular today. In the vernacular of the ancient Near East, a slave was also someone who could include someone who was enslaved, but it also could include someone who says, yes, I want to work for you for life. That person was also called an evet.
Yeah, all right, that concludes.
They didn't have the word slave.
We'll let Mark. Let's give you guys a couple closing statements, and then we'll wrap up. Keep it real short, though.
We get questions from the audience.
We've got a couple. Guys, send in your questions real quick, and then we'll wrap it up, And
so JiL basically conceded the argument. He basically conceded that I described debt slavery, that the Bible supported debt slavery. Now, I still think it does support chattel slavery as well. And I showed where you can own people as property and bequeath them to your children, which is chattel slavery. And JiL had no real answer to that except to say that I was gaslighting. He had no answer at all. It also says where you can sell marry a woman to a male slave and the children will become your property, which is in fact blood slavery, the third criteria that I had, that they were born into slavery, which is one of the criteria. Because even though JiL sort of said, hey, they have to commit a crime, they have to do wrong things, they have to do this, they have to be voluntary, that demonstrates unequivocally that that is not the case, because those children were born into slavery. So JiL is just 100% wrong. When it says punishing a slave, it has to be, you know, sort of somebody committing a crime. The verse he quoted never mentions slave. It just says when people are punished, that's what happens. The slavery one does not designate at all that it has to be a crime, and in no case do scholars believe that it has to be a crime. I think JiL's basically making apologist statements to try and show slavery in the ancient Near East in a better light than what it was. It wasn't as bad as antebellum slavery, and nobody is arguing that, but it still promotes that institution of owning one person as another person, and that is slavery, even though JiL wants to dress it up as an MBA contract. We all know that when you own somebody as the Bible describes, they are your property, because it doesn't say that you own their contract, it says you own them, and that's the big difference. Thank you.
all right, take a minute or two, JiL. Are you there? You're not muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully this is the last debate on this topic. I'm really tired of the gaslighting and not being honest in your reading of the text. You haven't demonstrated anything. Okay, the Bible denounces slavery as sin. We have evidence of that in the New Testament, the Old Testament. In fact, the New Testament goes so far as to put slave traders in the same category as murderers. I showed you scholars who show the distinctions between slave and enslaved. Mark never knew that was the case. How is he arguing for biblical slavery if he doesn't know there's a difference between enslaved and slaved? That scholars make that distinction. History makes that distinction. It's only in America or in modern day society in which we do not. If someone says you're a slave, it goes without saying, you're there against your will. That wasn't the case as late as 1611. In fact, they later called them serfs, S-U-R-F-S. Look that up. Serfs, S-U-R-F-S. So they were called slaves. They were later called serfs. And now we call them butlers and maids. But Mark wants to look back down the corridors of time and determine that because he sees the word slave in an English translation, that this person here is against his will. He hasn't demonstrated any of that from the context. What did Westbrook say? You must therefore use the context. The criteria should be the context. Not looking for the word purchase, not looking for the word buy, because what is he doing? He's assuming that purchasing and buying is of an involuntary nature, even though we still use that terminology today to describe situations that are not involuntary. So slavery within the Old Testament context was sanctioned due to slavery, and I'm quote unquote economic realities. So if someone was poor, they would work rather than racial or sexual prejudices or social prejudice. I'm just going to beat him because he's a slave. That's Mark's interpretation. He's a slave. Let's beat him. Let's get him. So because bankruptcy laws didn't exist, people would voluntarily sell themselves into servitude, we can call it. A craftsman, someone who drew, or someone who had some sort of skill, a carpenter, they could use their skills in servitude to discharge a debt. And as I mentioned, even a convicted thief could make restitution by serving as a slave, Exodus 22:3. So the liberating biblical truth is that all people are created by God with innate equality. So according to Genesis 1, Acts 17, Galatians 3. There's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave, nor free. We're one in Christ Jesus. The Bible does not promote slavery.
Okay.
Right. Are we all wrapped up now, Snake?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, would you mind reading off the questions, and then I'll call you?
For me, or is that for the competitors?
Well, they'll go through it. But
should we call each other? Or?
Yeah. Yeah. We'll just read off these. Okay. So Arctic Timberwolf asks, "Is a servant a slave?" And I assume this could kind of go either way. Let's have Mark answer first.
Yeah. So a servant was a slave, as in the word abed referred to debt slaves, ones who had entered voluntarily, as well as chattel slaves that could be passed down, the foreigners bought from other lands. Because they didn't have the word slave, a lot of it was context. A lot of it, to distinguish between the two, was a matter of the culture that person came from. But the important thing to remember is that they were both slaves, as in they both were property of another person. And if a ox gored a slave, the compensation would be paid to the master, not the slave, because as the Bible clearly stipulates in many cases, notably that passage about the ox and Exodus 21, the slave is their property, even if that slave became a servant voluntarily because of debt or financial issues.
Yeah, I will repeat the question again. I'm sorry.
It's down the bottom.
Oh, okay. The difference between a slave and a servant. Well, I think the Bible makes that distinction. So do scholars today. So do we today. Enslaved versus slave. A slave would be someone who, in the ancient Near East, they were basically one and the same. They used the word to describe both. So an Aved could be someone. That's why context is king here. An Aved could be someone who is forced. A vet could also be someone who is volunteering to work for life, and they want to be purchased, they want to be owned, they want to be bought. So if they want to be bought, they want to be purchased, you can't gaslight and use those words avoid of that context of their voluntary or their volition. You can't leave volition out of the situation. Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, we had sex, therefore rape. That doesn't work, now does it? So why are you doing that with the biblical text? Rape is forced sex. Okay, they're not the same. Rape is not the same as consensual sex. Stop conflating the two.
I don't know how it came to this, but here's our next question.
You like that analogy? You're muted.
What about people captured by the Hebrews? Are they slaves in the modern sense, like the Leviticus? I believe that would be for Jesus is Lord first.
Yeah, they were slaves in the modern sense, POWs. We wouldn't call them slaves today. We would call them prisoners of war. Mark wouldn't call them slaves today. People who are in Gitmo, people who are in Guantanamo Bay, he wouldn't call those people slaves. Just like he saw Brittany Greer in jail, he wouldn't call her a slave. He'd call her a political prisoner, right? But he will call, when the Hebrews do it to their criminals, he will call that slavery.
Can I respond to that? Or is this just a sort of one person response?
Free prisoners, right, Stephanie? Except the ones who commit heinous crimes. They belong in jail.
Hello?
And drunk driving, unlike what Biden says, if you're driving drunk, that is a felony. I know he said that shouldn't be a felony, but
hello?
Go ahead, Mark. It looks like they're out of.
Yeah, all right, they're gone. So the problem here is that when we imprison POWs, we don't have them as property to people. Like the people in Gitmo aren't property of anybody. They are.
Mark, you're doing it again. You're doing it again,
yeah,
Mark. What does the word property mean in the ancient Near East, Mark?
Could I finish, please? So we don't.
When you define your terms, you can finish. You haven't defined anything but slavery.
So We do, however, when you see things like in Numbers where they take all the prisoners, they allocate a certain amount to the temple and give them as plunder, and they use the word plunder very specifically. Like they divided up the plunder between the soldiers, such as they divided the livestock between the soldiers.
What does property mean? What does property mean in the ancient Near East?
Whereas in Guantanamo Bay, they are held not as property of the state, but as, you know, prisoners of the state.
What does property mean? You need to answer that for homework. Okay, you're not going to answer it here because you can't. For homework, answer in the ancient Near East, what does property mean to an ancient Near Easterner, not to what you want everybody to believe is going on in the ancient Near East today. Yeah, because we're using the word property to understand an inanimate object. That's not what it meant to the ancient Hebrews.
Right. So they don't use the word property. The translation is something like their money or their wealth is how it's sort of used. So it means the people that are part of their estate would be kind of a translation that would suffice. Those people belonged to that estate, to their wealth, their money.
Yeah, I would again, Dr. Harry Hoffner, University of Chicago. He is his money. He explains that. This has nothing to do. He's an expert in the cult of the Hittites, although he's a Hittitologist, but he can tell you a little bit something what was going on in the ancient Near East. He's not a biblical scholar, but he explains what these words mean. Purchase. These are just transactions, business transactions. They were not purchasing someone against their will. Mark still has not proven that anyone in the Bible is purchased against their will. He just sees the word purchase and then says it, and then the first thing that comes to mind is chattel slavery. That's done purposely. That's done purposely. I'm now starting to believe that you are being disingenuous.
Yeah, so it doesn't.
Because I've corrected you on that in this very debate, and you're still doing it.
Yeah, so it doesn't say whether they're purchased against their will or by.
It doesn't say that. Okay, so you're just going to assume that they are.
What it does say is that these people may be passed down as their wealth to their
if they want to be.
So that is a transfer of property.
Right.
And it
why is that wrong? Mark, you want to tell us why
they are transferred as a person would transfer.
Keep saying that, yeah. Why is that wrong? You want to tell us? You want to tell us why you dodged the debate topic, the original debate topic, Mark?
Money.
You want to tell us why you dodged the original debate topic that was supposed to be is biblical slavery moral? This is why you dodged that topic, because you don't want to deal with the minutia. You don't want to deal with the details. Is it wrong to purchase another person in America? In America, can I be arrested for purchasing another person? We're going to play your game. We're going to play your game. Go ahead. Answer the question.
Yes. If you purchase
tell me what law I broke if I were to purchase Snake. If I were to say to Snake, hey, Snake, I'm purchasing you for $20, and Snake says, yes, you may. Tell me what law we broke.
If you're purchasing him as property, you cannot
do
that. It violates
what law did we break?
All right, we're moving on.
We live in America.
We already have our scores, but we're going to put up some more questions for the audience.
You haven't broken any law.
You can't own slaves
okay.
in America.
Last question from the audience. For Jill, why do older translations, which weren't compiled by liberal scholars, use the word slave?
Older translation. All right, he's being funny there. Slim Jim is a Roman Catholic, so I call him my Romy. That's my Romy. All right, Roman Catholic. I don't know why. I think it's because of the 1611 King James is more of a word-to-word translation. And to them, someone who worked for someone else, this wasn't the case in ancient Israel, as we see in Eleazar, but to them, it was someone that was of a low status if they worked for someone else. And that was the case in many cases in ancient Israel. Poor people who didn't have any status, people who didn't have any land, they would work for someone else. So that word just took on a different meaning or connotation, and they interpreted it as slave. That word to them doesn't mean the same thing in 1611 as it does to us today. Today, we only use the word to describe one thing. So it is not fair, it is dishonest to keep saying slave, 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 and have the audience ignorant of what the word meant to them 5,000 years ago. It's completely disingenuous, completely wrong. You need to repent.
Mark, would you like to reply to that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, we use the word slave in a number of contexts these days. We recognize that it is still slavery. For instance, I went through a couple of them, sort of blood slavery, which was clearly in the Bible. We have chattel slavery, which was clearly in the Bible. The criteria for that is owning somebody as property and bequeathing them down. There was debt slavery. Jill even mentioned wage slavery that we have. So you don't need to be, sort of violently coerced into, say, debt slavery or wage slavery. You can actually be non-violently coerced. Like basically the situation can cause someone to become a wage slave, for instance, and have to work for a wage because they have no other choice. You can become a debt slave where your financial obligations force you into being a involuntary or voluntarily becoming a indentured to that person. It's interesting that Jill brought up serfs, although he spelt it incorrectly.
Sounds a lot like today. Yeah, I could take out a loan today.
Yeah, so serfs, that word serfdom is considered, and bonds people are considered a form of slavery. So there's many different types. So the word, when we use slave, it is accurately describing what was going on in the Middle East. I'm not sure, what Jill's saying.
The funny thing is that liberals today, and I'm not saying anyone on this panel is liberal, they consider credit card debt to be slavery. So you have to take that into consideration also. Taking out a loan, you're voluntarily taking out the money. So no one forced you to take out the money. Just because you're being forced to pay it back doesn't mean you're a slave. Nice try.